This is the shell we will be painting in watercolor. So I've made drew the line drawing all over this piece of 100mm hot press watercolor paper, and I will just rub out some of the darker lines. So we'll leave it quite dark so that you can see it while I'm painting, because it's a video. I just use my putty eraser. I use my number 8 silver brush. It's quite a big brush and it holds quite a lot of water. The colors are yellow ochre. So I will start off with just a few basic colors, and then at a later stage I might mix in a little bit more. And this was the first watercolor set that I bought. It was a little bit more pricier than the other ones that I first tried out. So I've had this palette for quite some time. I mixed in a little bit of the yellow ochre, and then I have the English red color that was part of the set. So you can use burnt sienna and you can use any normal yellow ochre. And then also I picked up a little bit of cadmium red just for that pink section on the shell at the top there. Just want to mix a little bit of that in. Hi Mr. D. And some sepia, and I might also use a little bit of black, and I can mix. If you find that the sepia is a little bit too warm, you can mix in a drop of ultramarine. I want to wet this whole section where I outlined the shell. I don't want any puddles. So just pick up some clean water, move it all over the shell, and it is summer here, so the painting the paper dries quite quickly. And I just move the water around to make sure that the paper is wet evenly all over the place. And now we're going to pick up a little bit of this English red mixture. So you can use burnt sienna. Burnt sienna will be perfect for this section as well. And you'll notice that I have these little scallopy sections on the shell which I just paint in. So basically we are dropping in some pigment, and this is called wet on wet, or wet in wet, whichever you prefer. I just look where I see the color everywhere, and I just drop it in and I let it flow wherever it wants to flow, and then I just move or manipulate it with my brush and move it to certain sections where I want the color to be. So this is just the basic mapping of this color, and then later on we will add in all the detail. So in the beginning of my painting, the water mixture or the paint mixture is quite watery, and then I move on to thicker paint as I get to the end of the paintings. And I want a watery mixture of the sepia. I will use this sepia color for all the shadowy parts, but I find that it's a bit too warm, so I want to mix in a drop of black. So you can use Payne's grey if you have Payne's grey, or if you have sepia, just mix in a drop of French ultramarine and it will be the perfect color. So I want to outline this whole shell with this watery mixture. Because the paper is white, I want the shell to show on the paper, so I'm just going to take my big brush and just outline the whole shell quickly with this very watery mixture. I'm going to leave that to dry. As you can see, the shell is very wet. I use my hairdryer and I make sure that the paper is completely dry before I start with the next mixture. And a little bit more of the black, so you can use either sepia with a little bit of ultramarine, or you can use the black This color is Buff Titanium from Daniel Smith. So I'm going to use a little drop of that. I'm not going to use that all the time, but I do want to incorporate this color a little bit. This color reminds me of the sea, and there's a little muggy bothering me here because of all the grapes that are ripening in the garden. So we have a lot of these little insects flying around. This is the red mixture, so you can use burnt sienna just with a drop of the sepia mixture in, because I want quite a dark outline on that little section. So again, I'm just layering all around the edges of the shell, and then I'm outlining this little section because I do want a difference between that. I will call that the wing of the shell, I think. I don't know what you call that little section on the shell part, but I will call it the wings for now. I'll have to check what they call it, but anyway, for now we will call it the wings or the sides of the shell. And I just want to darken that little section, but I make sure that the colors that I will use on both these edges will be different, so that we can see the difference between the parts of the shell that is the top part of the shell and then these little wings of the shell. And this is the number 5 Kum memory brush. So I want to make sure that I paint in this little scallopy details on the shell. This will make sure that the shell looks a little bit more realistic. So I make sure that I just paint all of the detail in, outline it, and then I just soften it with my brush with a little bit of clean water on the brush, and I just wiggle my brush around to soften it and take it all the way there. So at the same time I'm following the shape of the shell. So I'm starting to darken the little fan sections. Looks like a fan. So all of these little parts, I will just use this sepia dark mixture and just darken them and start mapping them in on the shell. And I need to be careful because I will wet or remove the paint with my hand, so I'm just very careful. And again, I'm darkening the sides of the shell because they have to look like they are rounded. So while the paper is dry, I will just remove a little bit more of the paint with my putty eraser. Just be careful so you don't hurt the paper. This is not the strongest paper. And a little bit more of the sepia mixture with the burnt sienna or the English red mixtures. It must be a rusty color, rusty brown red color. I want to darken these little lines. I just use a brush with a nice tip, and we will soften all of those little lines at a later stage. So it doesn't matter if the lines are not perfectly straight. We don't want straight lines. Mr. T is snoring here while I am doing the voiceover. He is currently on heart medication. I will explain all of that at a later stage. While we are busy painting what we discovered recently with Mr. T. So, again, the yellow ochre mixture. If you don't have yellow ochre, that is one of the colors that is my favorite color, so I can highly recommend that you get a small tube of yellow ochre color because you will use it quite often, especially even for stamens in the flowers. With the, if you want to paint stamens, we use quite a lot of the yellow ochre mixture in watercolor. And then you just use the tip of your brush and then you soften But again, so I want to create all of these little markings that I can see on the top of the shell. And again, you'll notice that my markings are not straight lines. And this will all, oops, I just messed some of the paint on the paper there, so I just remove it with my tissue paper. Hold your brush at an angle and create these little markings that you can see on the shell. And this way you will notice once you add in all the fan detail on the shell, it will make the shell look a lot more realistic than if you would have painted in straight lines. So again, just the same markings, and I mix between these two colors. So it is the yellow ochre mixture with the English red or burnt sienna mix, and then I just soften the lines again. At this stage you don't really have to soften the lines because we will paint so many layers over that eventually we will be able to remove all of that. But for now, I'm just softening the lines. I think I'm just so used to softening the lines immediately. I just mix between the colors, so I picked up a little bit of the cadmium red as well, just to bring in a little bit of that pinky color that you can see on the top of the shell there. And this is the more pinky color. And again, scallopy detail on the top there. And I'm just mapping in these colors. And then on this side too. So the color, this red, cadmium red, has a little bit of that burnt sienna mixture in, so it's not full on red. So it's a beautiful color. Do a little bit more of the English red. I need a bit more on the plate, so just pick it up with my brush and I just move it to the plate. A little bit more burnt sienna, sorry, not burnt sienna, yellow ochre. And with the same color I just paint in these little markings that create these fan markings on the shell. And you will notice that the markings towards the top of the shell are more narrow than the ones going to the bottom of the shell, so they sort of fan out, and this will create the realistic look of the shell. And then if I paint in too much detail, I'll just remove it, or a bit more too much pigment, I'll just remove it with a tissue paper. Oops, and it doesn't matter if you paint in lines, I'll remove that at a later stage. So just pick it up with my brush while it's still wet. Again, just adding in a detail. This is the buff titanium. And again, the top is narrow, so there's very small space between the top and the bottom of the shell. So these little lines fan out beautifully to the edge of the shell, and then just move around and darken these little markings. It's not too dark, but just dark enough. And you'll see that eventually it all comes together. So just pick up a little bit more of the sepia. And I tried to paint in all these little lines. And then I just soften the lines with the tip of my brush with clean water. I just want to make sure that the lines aren't too hard. It's easier to remove the hard lines now than later in the painting when it is bone dry on the paper. So I prefer to remove all the hard lines now. And then again, just soften the lines with clean water and have your tissue paper ready, and just pick up all the excess pigment with your tissue paper. And you'll see I wiggle my brush around to soften all of these little hard lines. I still want to keep the highlighted white parts of the top of the shells of these little scallopy parts as light as possible. So I just use my tissue paper to remove some of the excess pigment. And all along I just go and darken the sides of this shell going down to the bottom of the page so it looks like it is more rounded. And again, I want to soften this little section as well. Now you can use your scrubber brush. I just use this little brush. It's quite a hard synthetic brush, so it's easy to soften the lines. And then pick up a little bit more of the sepia mixture. So I want to start with the lines on this side. So the fan parts of the shell I want to paint in on this section here. Now just soften the lines again with my brush. We're just mapping in all of these little markings. The buff titanium. And soften again. Just add in a drop of the sepia black mix. And I'm very careful to use the tip of my brush just to mark in all of these little lines. And with the clean water, make sure your brush is clean all the time so you don't move that dark mixture all over your paper. So again, a little bit of the red, ochre, yellow, red mixture, like the mixture that we have there. I just want to add a little bit more of a darker color in there. And then I just soften the lines so that it looks like the sides are coming up towards the top part of the highlighted section of the shell. So those top parts of the shell we want to keep as light as possible. We don't want too much of the dark pigment on the top part. And then when I have too much pigment, I just again move it with the brush with clean water. And you can see already that the shell is starting to look a bit more realistic. I want more of the red ochre. So this is a mixture between burnt sienna and the yellow ochre. I would say it is a lovely rusty color compared to the red English red mixture that I have on my palette. And this little section is a little bit darker, so right over the middle of the fan of the shell I want the lines to be very dark and quite thick, not too dark obviously, but darker than most of the shell. So again, just soften the line. There are two lines that are quite dark on the shell, so I want to map those in already so that I remember that I have to keep them dark. Again, just soften the line with my brush. So again, you can use any colors that you have on your palette or in your paint box. You don't have to go out and buy these colors. I would say that colors that you will use in watercolor quite a lot will be yellow ochre. You will always use burnt sienna. A lot of watercolor artists use burnt sienna. And maybe sepia or paint gray. So you'll notice the lines are not perfectly straight, and I create little markings that you will see on the paper. All of this will shine through. All the bottom layers or the top layers that we will add over all of these little lines will shine through. So they are a lot darker than the rest of the shell, and that will create the indents of the shell. And if you can just imagine that this is a flat piece of paper and we are creating all of these little markings with a brush and pigment. So it looks very 3D and realistic. So this will take some time to add in all of the little lines, but this is what will make the shell look very realistic. Again, you can see that the way I am painting right now is much thicker than the top part of the shell, so this looks very much like a scallopy shell. I'm not sure what the exact name is. I cannot find this shell in my shell book, so I will have to search what the exact name is, but it looks very similar to a fan shell or to a scallop shell. Colors are quite interesting too. It's very beautiful. And again, just use the tip of your brush to create these little markings, and you'll see that I change the color all the time that I have on the palette. So I move around with all the different colors. Just want to move it out the way so I can get in there. And then I want to create those little dots that I can see on the shell there. So I just dab the brush in certain parts, and I want to make sure that the paper soak up these little markings that I create before I soften them with my brush. So just dab it on the paper, move the brush up and down, make these wiggly sounds or wiggly markings. Now, I don't know how you will make wiggly sounds, but anyway. And again on this little part of the shell as well. So I just dab the brush in certain little parts, and certain little sections are a lot darker than other sections. Now again, you don't have to add in all of this detail. You can keep it very plain, or you can create all of the detail. All depends on what you want to create in your watercolors. You will notice that each year your painting style will change, and that happens to everyone. You might want to paint a little bit looser, or you want to add more detail, or sometimes you want to do both, and that is the only way that you will move forward with your art, is if you can adjust your paint and try to paint loose paintings and paintings with a little bit more detail. That is all up to you in the end, what you want to paint and what type of detail and how much detail you want to add to your paintings. Now I just go back and I darken certain little parts of the shell. And while I am painting and you watching, I will quickly explain what happened to Mr. T recently. So I've been taking Mr. T to our vet, which I've had for many years, and they discovered a tiger had a little murmur, heart murmur. However, the last couple of weeks I just found that Mr. T was not well, so I took him for a second opinion, and they were quite shocked that Mr. T was not on medication. So he is now on the third day on his heart medicine and on water tablets. I have to take him back in 2 weeks' time to check how he is, but to be honest, it was a very scary time for us because I could hear that there was a lot of moisture and in his breathing, and he battled to breathe, and he had like a cough, and it was just getting worse and worse and worse, and I could see that he just wasn't well. But luckily he's now on medicine, and I will keep you all posted, especially my patrons and my Instagram followers, because you guys are so awesome with him. Everyone loves him so much, so we'll keep you guys posted. So just to get back to this little part of the wings of the shell, I just darken them slightly with the sepia mixture. Now make sure that I keep a straight line so that you can see the difference between the whole shell and then these wings of the shell. And again, I just use a very watery mixture to darken the edges there of the shell so it stands up or off the paper, so it looks like it is more realistic, and you can just see the difference that created what I've added in now onto the painting. Certain parts of the shell is darker, so this little section I just darken, and I make sure that I use the tip of my brush, and this is why I use a brush with a nice point. So any brush with a nice point will be perfect for adding in these little lines. I don't think a rounded brush will work for this, but it's up to you. If you can get it right, maybe flatten the little hairs, it will be perfect to use if you get it right. I just find that either a small brush or a brush with a nice point create these little markings a lot easier for me. So I just try to follow the shape of all the markings that I can see, and again the shape of the shell, and you can see already that it is looking a lot more like a shell than what it did when it was just a line drawing on the paper. I love painting shells. I love shells. I have quite a collection of shells that I've collected for many years. I love to study shells. I love to sit and watch them. It is just magical. They are so beautiful and fascinating, and I will highly recommend a very good YouTube video that I have watched recently. It is absolutely amazing, and I will put it on a link at the bottom for you, or just a name, so that you can go and watch it and search it. It is absolutely amazing. It is from South Africa, but honestly so interesting. And I look at shells differently now, especially the certain coney shells, because I watched that YouTube video, and you will see why when you watch it. So please watch it. It is amazing. I'm not affiliated with them at all. It was just a brilliant YouTube video. And if you love shells and you love nature and you love animals, then I can highly recommend that. And I just use a watery mixture again on this section, and as you can see, I've nearly mapped in all of the lines, and the ones on the edges are a lot narrower than the ones on the middle of the shell as well, and that will all create that 3D realistic look that we are looking for. And this is that red rusty brown color mix. I will add in the color swipes so that you can see and have it, and you can see which colors you have in your paint box or on your palette to get to close enough to that as possible. But again, use what you have. At the same time, creating all of those little markings on the edges as well. And darkening. So I go and I just darken the lines all the time, and you can see some of the layers that I've added in earlier still shines through the top layers that I just added in. And I leave the highlighted parts between these lines as light as possible, because they will help to create the realistic look that we want on the shell. And I prefer to layer my colors like this. A little bit more sepia. And I want to darken these little wings on the sides of the shell. Leave highlighted sections or lighter parts between these little markings that we are painting in. Keep the lines neat. And I didn't soften these lines with my brush. I want them to soak in to the paper, and then we will soften all of those little markings at a later stage. Just want to remove that hard line there. Again, the red mixture, and now I just draw those or paint those little lines that we can see on the shell on the side of the wings there. And I want to darken those little markings that I painted in earlier, and I don't go back and soften the lines with my brush, so I just paint in these tiny little markings. Use the tip of your brush. And now I'm just softening those little lines that I painted in earlier. And with a very watery mixture, I just go in between the lines. Now we want to create those little markings that I can see on that side of that shell again. And you will notice as I get to the end of the painting, or closer to the end of the painting, I always have a much darker, thicker consistency, because we're adding in a lot more detail. So your paint becomes more thicker, except if you still want to add a little bit of a watery mixture on your paint like I did now, then you will use some water. Now here I use a little bit of the sepia mixture because I want it to look darker on the sides of the shell. That will create that rounded realistic look, otherwise it will just look flat on the paper. So I just have a very watery mixture and I just add it in there, and just look the difference of what that markings or the paint that we just painted on there created on the sides of the shell there. Then I just take my tissue paper and lighten it a little bit. Don't want too much pigment on my painting or paper there. Again, I just move it around, soften some of the markings. Now on this side, I'm going to add a little bit of that sepia mixture, very watery, and move it around. Careful not to go out with the lines there. Very watery mixture on the edges there, because I want it to be a little bit darker so that it stand up, or out of the, so you can see the shell on the paper, I will say. So I just add this mixture on the tip of the shell there. Don't take it everywhere yet. and then I just dab it up with a tissue paper, and again on this side, and I make these little scalloping markings because it's not a straight shell. Some of it cracked while it was in the ocean, so there are tiny little tips that are out, that are broken away from the whole shell, and that's what makes it look so scallopy, and all the detail on the tips of the shell. And now I just take water and I use a glaze all over this painting to soften all of those little hard lines that we painted in earlier. If I notice some of the pigment moved all over the place, I will just use my tissue paper to soften all of these little hard lines. Now we've softened most of these lines. This is how far we are now. And sometimes we have load shedding and I cannot use the electricity, so the light is not on. So the power comes on in about 2 hours, but for now we will paint. It's still a lovely bright day, so you should be able to see what I am painting. And I will zoom in so it's very close to the paper so you can see exactly what I am doing. And for this, I'm just now layering all the beautiful red rusty colors over the bottom layers that I've added in on the paper earlier on this shell. And I just take my time, step back and look at the shell painting where I want to add a little bit more detail. Just go back and forth, pick up more color. So I pick up some yellow ochre, some of the English red, or in your case maybe burnt sienna, and some sepia. And you can see there's a mixture of quite a few colors on the section that I'm working on right now. So I just pick it up with my brush and I just move it around. And the mixture is, I would say, runny to creamy, but not thick. And then I just darken this little scallopy section here. Just layering over all of the colors that we've added in earlier so that we can darken these little sections on the shell. And I still want to keep certain little sections lighter, so I will go back later and just darken the little fan lines, so the scallopy indents of the shell I will just darken at a later stage. But for now I'm quite happy with how this has turned out. And I love the way that all these different colors are coming together. This is the gold color that I have, so I would think a nice bright yellow will be beautiful, mixed with maybe some yellow ochre and a little bit of the orange color as well. So I just pick some colors up that I think will be pretty with this painting on the shell. The colors, if I see one color doesn't look perfect, and I just pick up a little bit more of the other colors. And then again I just soften all of these little markings with my brush. A little bit more of the English red color. So you'll notice that I pick up a little bit of color every time I like the fact that I can adjust the color all the time, so I don't mix the perfect shade of the previous color every time. I want all the colors to be different each time that I mix the colors, so that all of the colors that I painted first will shine through the top layers. And you will notice that, as I mentioned before, as you start adding in all the detail, your consistency of your paint on your palette becomes a little bit thicker. Then you will also adjust and go back to a very watery mixture to glaze certain sections of your art again, or the shell in this case again. And that is the way that we create all of these realistic markings on the shell, is by thickening these little mixtures of watercolor paint on our palette. This is one of my favorite parts of painting, is where you start adding in all of the fine detail. Now again, you don't have to add in all of the markings on the shell. You can just darken these little lines and leave it, and maybe just darken some of the orange and pinky colors on the shell, and then you can leave it. You don't have to make the little lines over the scallopy sides of the shell like I did. I just did it because I like to add all of these little details on the shells. For me, that is the fun part of painting shells. I've painted some shells that are very loose. I will link them at the bottom of this tutorial as well. A lot of the shells that I've painted previously were paintings that I wanted to do under 30 minutes. Unfortunately, this one is a little bit longer than 30 minutes, but you can paint this in 30 minutes. So it just won't have as much detail as this one that we currently painting. But you can definitely paint this in half an hour. If you don't have time, I suggest that you just leave it for the next day, and hopefully you have a workspace where you don't have to pack all your art away and then take it out the next day again to paint. That way will make it so much harder to enjoy your hobby and the things that you want to do. I find that if at one stage when I started painting in watercolor, I didn't have a little table or place to pack all my stuff so that I can leave it just to go back when I have a moment. So it was much harder, so you don't feel like painting sometimes because you just don't feel like packing everything out and packing everything away again. So if you can, while you're busy painting with something, leave it out on the table. Hopefully you don't have family members that will move your painting or mess on it, coffee or something. But leave it out on the table so that you can just go back and finish your paintings whenever you have a moment. So hopefully you have a place where you have like a little studio or a little room or a little table or a little spot where you can do your favorite thing. I also love to sometimes move around. I sometimes like to paint on a different table. That way, for instance, sometimes during summer, that is, by the way, the number 5 memory brush that I'm using. But sometimes it is very hot in my studio, even though I have a fan there and a massive aircon. Sometimes I just want to move to a more shadier spot because it is sometimes so bright where my little studio is that I cannot see on the paper. I have to close the blinds. So I do move around, but then I just go back again to my favorite spot where I paint and all my goodies are. And I know a lot of us have a lot of different mediums that we paint in. So our art collections or supply collection for art is quite massive. I know I have quite a few goodies myself, so I try to keep that as neat as possible, but especially if you have to move around and carry your things to, for instance, a place where you're going to feel comfortable to paint, I think that will be a little bit frustrating. if you have to move your things around all the time, except if you have a massive suitcase or something, to make it easier to use. But it's not always possible. Not everyone have a lot of space. I know that too. So in that regard, I will keep my supplies that I'm busy with currently to the minimum. That way you don't have so much to carry or pack out all the time. Anyway, back to our painting. So those little wings on the side of the shell painting, or the shell, I want a little bit darker, as you can see on the reference photo just above. I want those little sections very dark, so that will just create this beautiful 3D or realistic look on your shell. And then I start with the little markings. So just use the tip of my brush. And so just little straight lines, and then a few of them are not even lines. So I just want to create those little markings, and some are full on lines from the beginning to the end, and some are just halfway. And then just go back and darken certain little sections and add a little bit more detail to make it look more realistic. And again, darkening of that other little wing side of the scallop shell. And I'm quite happy with that one now, so I'm just going to tap up a little bit of the excess paint that I've had there. Don't want it to be too dark. And then let's darken this little section here. So again, just the tip of my brush, and I hold it at an angle, so I have a little bit more control over where I add all the paint. So certain sections are a little bit darker than other parts of the shell. And I have quite a few shells that I've painted over the years. I will take some photos and share them. I do have them on Instagram as well. And again, I just darkened it, so I added a little bit more of the pinky color on this section. And then just move the paint around to soften all of those hard lines. Again, darken this little part here. And then I will go back and soften those little lines at a later stage. So just pick up some of the paint and darken those little edges there. I want those to be quite dark to show that it goes down, and they're also a lot narrower than the middle of the shell. And now I want to build up on the sides of the shell, so where they go up towards the top part of the scallopy shell part, the rise of the little scallop, I would say. I'm not sure what you call those, but also make sure that these little lines are at an angle, so I move them sort of like a half C or half moon, just to create the effect that it is going up and down. That will create a realistic look on the shell again. And then I just want to darken this little section as well. So the colors are quite dark. And I just move the brush up and down to create those little markings. Some I take totally over, some I just do halfway. And again, you don't have to add all of these little details on the shell. I just like to add them. I'm going to paint a realistic shell, so I might as well just go all out and create all the little markings that I can see or what I want to add. It will also look nice if you don't add all of them, so it's all up to you. Again, make this painting your own. On this part, I use my cell phone just to get a different angle of the painting, and I will share with you right now what I've recorded there. It is in view there. I'm sorry about that, but I wanted to get as close to what I am painting on the paper so that I can share it with you. So I will add that in as well, just so you can see what exactly I am doing and the markings I'm creating. And this is what I did and how I added in some of the detail on the shell. So this is just a very wobbly close-up, and I just pick up a little bit more of the darker color. I picked up a little bit of sepia mixture there, and I want to go to as close to that side of the shell as possible. So I just pick up my brush and move my brush and create a little line there, and then I will soften it. So I just pick up a little bit more water to soften those little lines, and then I let the paint move all over. I don't mind if it flows everywhere. I just want that little section to stand out, and you can already see it just creates this beautiful 3D look on this section of the shell. So that is what will make the shell look a lot more realistic and 3D. And I will also add the video where I painted these little lines on the shell, those tiny little lines that we created over the highest part of the scallopy fan shell. And again, just that little section as well where it sort of broke off. And I just want to darken those little markings there as well. I'm sorry, I moved the camera around quite a lot, so I do apologize for that. But I just wanted to show a close-up of what I am adding and how I'm adding in all of the little details. I hope you can see. And I pick up a little bit of the darker sepia mixture because I want those little dots, I want to paint in those little markings. Again, that is now a lot lighter that we've added in earlier, and at the same time I try to darken each section as well. So I just use the tip of my brush, so where I can see I need to darken certain sections, I darken it with that dark color that I have on my palette. Move it around, take it up, and I also want to create a little rounded sections that you can't really see on the paper, but I want to create it on the shell on the edges there. Now we're back to the previous slide. So this is again the little lines that I am painting in. But that was just to show you what I am painting and how I am painting it, what I find work for me. Again, this is up to you. You can, if you find you have to add the darkest markings first, then do that if it works for you. I find that if I add in most of the detail and then add the markings, that works for me. So again, this is just up to you. Whatever you prefer, whatever you feel you more comfortable with, do what works for you. I'm just here to share how I paint and what I do. So make this shell, like I said, your own. And you can just see already everything is just coming together beautifully on the shell. It looks so much more realistic. I will also share another little video that I made where I create these little markings, but I hope you can see anyway what I do with the brush. It's as close as the paper as I can get. The camera is touching my head, so it's in the way all the time. I have to move my neck so that I can get as close to the painting as possible. I prefer to have the camera above so that you can see exactly what I do instead of having it on the side, because on the side you can't really see the exact markings that I am creating. Just going over with the brush quickly over certain sections that I want to darken again. And another close-up of the way I add my little details. I just dab the brush on the paper with the tip of my brush with enough pigment, but not too much water on my brush. I don't want my brush to be too wet yet, because we want to add in all of these little markings. So the mixture is quite thick, and keep your brush dry. I find I keep my brush dry when I add all of these little markings, so it's not too wet. And sometimes you will see that you have too much paint on your brush, so just dab it on the tissue and soak up some of the excess. There you go, and that's what I painted in. So this is how you will get your markings. So the electricity is on again, so I can paint with the light on. And for this part I just sped it up so that, you know, the video again is not too long for everyone. I know a lot of you lose a little bit of interest because we just keep on adding layer after layer, so I just sped this up. We do exactly what we did earlier. So I'm just darkening these little lines, and I go back and forth and stand up and check your painting. So walk away and sometimes just ask some of your family members what the you know, if it looks like a shell, if it doesn't just look like a flat piece of painting on a paper. You want it to look quite realistic. So just take your time and ask everyone if they think, or a friend, if it at least look a little bit realistic, if that's what you want. You want it to look realistic. And again, just darkening this little section here on the side of the shell. Let's just wet it with some water to soften those lines. So I want it quite dark, as you can see on the reference photo. And we're just building the layers again like we did previously. So we're doing exactly what we did before. That's why I've sped up certain parts, because we're just darkening certain little sections on the painting that we've already painted earlier. And I'm just dabbing little markings on the corner there. I want to create those little dots that I can see on the reference photo. Just a few little markings. And I use the dark sepia mixture there. Creating those little rounded little half C's or half moons over the shell again. And I try to follow the shape of the shell. So just carry on adding all of the little detail, and you can see what I am painting right now is just to create all of those little markings on the shell, and then I just darken certain little sections again following the shape of the shell, and that will all create the realistic look that we want for the shell. And remember, what I said, this is totally optional. You don't have to add all of the detail in that I am painting on the shell. You can leave it all out if you prefer. And you can see that I just move around on the palette. I pick up certain little colors that I think will go with certain parts of the shell. So I swap between the dark sepia mixture and then that burnt sienna or the English red color that we have on the palette there. So you can just look at what colors I pick up on the plate there to make it easier for you to follow along. And again, just darkening these little lines on the shell. More markings. And you can see all of these little markings that I add now just create a more realistic look than what it was a few minutes ago, just by darkening little sections on the shell a little bit more. And that's sometimes where we make mistakes, especially I did when I started painting in watercolor. I would stop too early with my painting and then think it's finished, but then not realizing it looks so totally incomplete. And now that you know how to add, just take the chance and just take it a little bit further, just add in a little bit more detail. Your paintings will look a lot more realistic if that is the style of painting that you like. So just carry on and just obviously don't overdo it, but just go in and add more detail, go darker, but do it slowly, so layer by layer by layer, and then you'll notice that your paintings just look so much more realistic than what it would if you just stop too early. So again, I'm still here. I'm just darkening the lines, and I want to create a little bit more darker values on certain parts of the shell. I just received a nice cup of coffee, so do take a break and just go and have a nice cup of coffee and come back with fresh eyes. And sometimes when you do feel stuck and you just don't know if you finish or should you carry on, what I normally do in that situation is that I stand up, I just step away, I just go for a walk, I just walk through the garden, go make myself a nice cup of tea, and then I would come back later and really look at the painting again, and then just, you notice certain things, you notice parts where maybe you didn't add a little, you didn't add enough tonal values on the edges of your shell, or maybe you can darken a little section here or there on the shell. Oh, thanks Abigail, I just received a biscuit and she just popped it on my watercolor paper, quickly removed it. And just by doing that, just by coming back at a later stage and just really looking at your painting again, you'll notice that maybe it's time to stop, or maybe let me just carry on and add a little bit more detail. And sometimes a cup of coffee is so delicious while you paint. And what I normally do is I put my cup of coffee on the opposite side of what I am painting. So if hand that I use for painting, so if I paint with my right hand, I have the cup of tea on the left hand side, because I've dipped my brush numerous times in my cup of coffee, and I've known of so many watercolor artists that say the same thing. It happens to them too. If you put your cup next to your water for your watercolor, and you dip it in, you will dip it in your coffee or tea. So just be careful, just remove it, rather put it on the other side. We've all done that before. And then another thing just to remember is certain watercolors are toxic, so also keep it away from your animals, and also don't consume it. They are toxic. Not all of it, but some of them are toxic, so just be careful. If you've dipped in quite a lot of pigment, make sure you rather make a fresh cup of tea or fresh cup of coffee instead of having that where you dipped in your brush into your tea or coffee. And again, I'm just going back and darkening certain sections of the painting, and you will notice that I also pick up my big watercolor brush, and then I will just soften all over the whole painting with a glaze of clean water. That way I will soften all of these little hard lines. Just one thing to note about a glaze: when you glaze over a painting, you sometimes can remove too much of your watercolor paint, so be careful. You don't want to go back and redo all the tonal values again, so do it very softly. Use a very big mop brush or one of the softest brushes that you have. It's a slight soft motion, it's like a butterfly's wing touch on your skin. That is what it should be, just very, very soft light touches to prevent you from removing too much of the paint. So just do a very slight lift, if that makes sense, with your brush, a soft sweep over the painting. Rather test a certain section first, let it dry completely before you do the glaze, just to make sure the paper and the paint absorbed enough into the paper so that you don't remove too much of your paint from your painting with a watercolor glaze. Especially if you paint flowers and you added a lot of detail where you don't necessarily soften the lines. Just be careful when you do that, and also be careful when you have highly pigmented watercolors that you can wash off very quickly. In that case, I will rather not do a glaze and just soften the lines. Sometimes when you use a red with, for instance, a very highlighted section on your flower and you do a glaze, you might move some of the pigment into the highlighted section where you don't want any of the red mixture that you, for instance, painted on the flower. So it's just something to remember. I do a lot of glazes, but I'm very super careful, very careful with my brush. But I'm also very careful with my highlights. You don't want to lose your highlights. You can never get your highlights back on paper if you've mixed a red highly pigmented watercolor paint. So just be very careful when you do that. And just darkening this again. So I'm very careful not to go over the top part of the shell where I want to leave that highlighted section as light as possible. And then I just wiggle the brush to create little different lengths of watercolor on the sides there. I don't want a solid line, I just want it to go up onto the sides. So I'm very careful, and then if I notice I have too much pigment or the lines are too dark, I just go back and soften the lines with my brush with clean water quickly. And have your tissue paper ready with you so that you don't so that you can remove the pigment quicker than what you would without a piece of tissue. It's always frustrating to have to go and quickly find a piece of tissue and it's already in your absorbed into your paper, and you cannot remove it, especially if you don't want to remove the bottom layers of your paint. So always make sure I have a box of tissues or a hand roll near me when I paint. So what I'm going to do now is I just want to add the little shadow part on the bottom of the shell. So very carefully with my number 5 Cool Memory brush, I mixed a watery mixture of sepia, and I want to create those little scallopy parts of the shell at the bottom there as well. So I'm very careful. I want to, because this is where you paint negatively to create the markings on the bottom part of that shell section there. And I just picked up a little bit of the black because I noticed the sepia is maybe too watery, and create those little scallopy parts at the bottom of the shell again. So move your brush and push it into the shell very carefully, and all the time I will, please, I've made many mistakes in my life before. Be very careful painting this little shadow part now. You don't want too much of the pigment there. So again we have a little bit of load shedding, so just excuse the light again. And what I'm going to do is just mix a little bit more of the black and the sepia, and I'll pick up a lot of water because I want it very watery. With this I want to be very careful. I've messed up a lot of paintings where I painted too dark little shadowy parts on the bottom of my paintings. So I'm rather going to wet this section first, and then I'm just going to dip in some of the darker mixture so that I'm very careful and I don't create a dark line. So by doing this that I'm doing right now, by wetting the paper first, you cannot go wrong with dripping or dropping in some of this dark paint, because it will flow everywhere, but you can remove it quickly. Whereas when you go in with straight pigment on the dry paper, it will immediately soak into the paper and you will not be able to remove it very easily. And also make sure that the mixture is very watery, like I have there right now on the paper, and have your tissue paper ready so that you can dab up some excess pigment so that you don't mess it up and it doesn't flow all over the place. So I'm very careful here. Slow little brush strokes, very watery. It's very important that we just keep it light. You can always go back later and darken it, but it's so much more difficult to remove pigment because you do ruin the paper fibers when you have to remove paint. And I don't want it to be an equal line either. I make sure that it's all right next to the shell. And this will take quite some time just to get it right, but rather do watery layer by layer than going into dark is much easier. That's what I found. I found that if I go into dark, it's much more difficult to remove those little, especially this color, this even Payne's grey is very difficult to remove. Sepia, all dark colors are very difficult to remove because they're very highly pigmented. And I just push the little tip in to create those little scallopy markings again on this section. And you can see it already looks so realistic. And then I just slowly remove the excess pigment again and wipe it off on my tissue paper. Just notice that one needs a little bit more of a darker little line there. It's too flat on the paper. So just slowly darkening those little markings there again, and that side too. Now I wouldn't have noticed it if I didn't stand up and really look at my painting, because it really looked like that side was just disappearing, and I don't necessarily want that for this style of painting. Pick up a little bit of that English red mixture. Beautiful colors, and we are nearly finished with this painting. Wow, the lights came on, wonderful. Okay, so we just want to make sure we create those little markings. And you see that I just use a little bit of the pigment that's on the plate just to adjust the tonal values ever so slightly, and I don't go in with a too dark mixture, so I just go on the sides of the shell to create that effect like it's going up towards the top of the shell, and a little bit of the markings again on the sides on this section as well. This is a very watery mixture, as you can see on the side of the plate there where I pick it up. So very watery mixture. We don't want it to be too dark. And then I just create a few little lines in certain little spots. And again some crossover lines over the shell to create the effect of a rounded shape. And on this section I just push it up towards the top, and then on that side I just pull it up. So again, just using the tip of my brush, I want a little bit more of the English red mixture, yellow ochre, and on this side the same applies. So we're just basically adding in detail where I think I need to create a little bit more texture on the shell. And for this painting, I hope you will enjoy painting this shell, there are loads of texture and detail on this part of the shell. So this is a very good practice if you want to learn just a few basic skills in watercolor, especially if you are a beginner and you feel like you need a little bit of a challenge. And in this video there are loads of challenging effects that we are painting, lots of texture, lots of little detail, lots of lines, lots of tonal value. It's just a very fun painting to paint. So I will also post the looser shells that I've painted. You will find them on Patreon. I will put the link in on the index. I think it is on the index, but it's also a very fun painting to paint. They're also on YouTube. You should also try and paint some loose watercolor shells. They are fun to paint. So in the next tutorial it will be much shorter, but also with loads of detail, loads of watercolor effects that we will be using. We won't paint any difficult flowers for the next few tutorials. This will be just a few quick lovely little studies that we will be painting, and then we will paint the odd flower here and there, but obviously those are a little bit longer because we paint quite a lot of detail. But I'm also going to paint a rose without too much detail. And then again I'm just using the little scrubber brush softly over the paper to remove those little hard lines of the water that the paint created. So it was water little markings. And then I just darken the shadow section of the shell again. Very watery mixtures. I picked up a little bit of sepia. I want to go straight against the shell there, very carefully, and then I just take my brush and just soften those lines there, and just use your tissue paper to pick up the excess. And I'm going to soften those little lines there a little bit more, just with a scrubber little brush, darken this little section. I just feel I have to darken the shadowy parts of the shell. This will create this beautiful 3D effect of the shell on the watercolor paper. I also find if you paint a shadow with leaves, it just creates that beautiful 3D effect on the paper, especially because the paper is white. And just certain parts, as you can see, just creating those darker little markings, they create that beautiful little scallopy section again on that bottom of the shell there. And I just push the brush in to create those markings. Just take it up to the top there. The more you go up towards the top, it is a more narrow little shadow there. So just remember to keep the lines small and very light in there. And I couldn't paint it in earlier, so by painting negatively on this bottom part of the shell, it will create these beautiful scallopy sections that you can see that I'm creating right now there with my brush. And I'm quite happy with this. Just take your brush and soften the lines if you're not happy with the dark markings. So just blend it in with your scrubber brush. And this is the end of the shell painting. I hope you will try and paint this, and I hope you will have fun. And just try your best to get to a realistic shell. But like I said, if you don't want to paint a realistic shell, then just try and paint without all of the excess detail. So I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and I will be back with a new tutorial soon. Everything you need to complete this shell will be in the booklet and underneath the Patreon, under the shell section on the Patreon and the attachments. Have fun and have a wonderful week. See you soon.